Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH, the main hall. There came a knock on Nicodemus's office door. It opened, and Justin and Mr. Aegis entered. "Back so soon?" said Nicodemus. "Soon?" said Justin. "It's past noon, and it's lunchtime." "Past noon!" Mrs. Frisbee stood up, remembering her children waiting at home. Down in the rat's room, in the artificial light, it was hard to tell the passage of time, and she had been so engrossed in Nicodemus's story that she had not glanced at the clock. Justin was wearing a satchel like Nicodemus's, and from it he took a small paper package. "Here's Dragon's medicine," he said, putting it on the table. Yes, Mrs. Frisbee. "Did he tell you about the toy tinker?" Nicodemus said. "No, I was just coming to that part." "But I can't stay to hear it right now," said Mrs. Frisbee. "My children are waiting for their lunches." A plan was worked out, and Mrs. Frisbee would go home to take care of her children. Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur, and the other rats involved would work out the details of moving her house, which would be done that night at about 11 o'clock. "After the Fitzgibbons are asleep, we're sure Dragon is too," said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisbee would return in the mid-afternoon to the rosebush. Mr. Aegis said, "And I'm going to lie down after taking that trip with this cast. I'm super tired." "You can have your choice of rooms," said Nicodemus. "Now that Jenner and his friends are gone, we have 7 empty rooms." "Thank you," said Mr. Aegis. "Mrs. Frisbee, when you return, I will tell you as well as I can how to put the powder in the Dragon's bowl." As she hurried home, Mrs. Frisbee considered just how much she should tell her children about all that had happened and all that was going to happen. She decided at that stage, at least, she would not tell them about their father's connection with the rats. Also, she would not say she had volunteered to put the sleeping powder into Dragon's bowl. That would worry them. She could tell them, perhaps, but when it was safely done, when, amongst other things, there would be no chance for Martin to volunteer in her place. She would tell them simply that an owl had suggested it. She had gone to the rats and asked for help. She had found them friendly and intelligent, and a group of them were coming that night to move the house to a place where it could be safe from the plow. And that would be enough. She could tell them the whole story later after she knew it all herself. But it was not enough. The children were skeptical at first, and then intensely curious, especially Timothy, who was looking stronger and feeling more energetic, but still staying in his bed, primarily because Teresa and Martin had made him. "But why should the rats do that?" said Timothy. "We don't know them at all. Nobody does. They keep to themselves." "Maybe it's because the owl sent me," said Mrs. Frisbee, searching for an answer that would satisfy him. "They seem to be impressed with the owl." "For that matter," said Timothy, "I don't even see why the owl wanted to help. He's no friend of ours either." "Maybe they thought someday we could do a favor in return." "Oh, Mother," said Cynthia, "how could we ever do them a favor?" "You forget I did do Jeremy a favor. That's what started this whole thing." "That and my getting sick," said Timothy. "I wish I could get up. I'm tired of being in this bed." "Not yet," said Mrs. Frisbee, glad to change the subject. "You must have your strength, because tonight you will be getting up for a little bit when they move the house. We must be sure you're all wrapped up and hope that the night is warm." "It will be," said Martin. "It turned quite hot outside." Then they ate lunch. That afternoon Mrs. Frisbee told the children that she must leave them to confer with the rats about moving the house. When she thought of the dangers she would face in just a few more hours, she wanted to kiss them all goodbye, but knowing that Timothy, at least, was already suspicious, she did not dare, but told them only that they should not worry if she was a little late getting home from dinner. On her way back to the rosebush, she felt quite relieved, almost cheerful. Her problem was nearly solved, and the final solution was in sight. If all went well, Timothy would be saved. If all went well, then the thought of what she had to do came back to her like a clanging of an alarm bell. When worried, her most was not so much putting the powder into Dragon's food, but the fear that at the last minute she might lose her nerve and bungle up into somehow. That would wreck the plans. She looked toward the Fitzgibbons' house, and there on the porch, lying in the sun, was Dragon. He was watching a pair of sparrows playing in the grass halfway to the chicken yard. The tip of his tail barely twitched as he debated whether or not they were near enough to spring for it. He looked very big and very dangerous. At least he was not looking in her direction, and Mrs. Frisbee hurried on to the bush, directly to the hidden entrance, and slipped inside. When she reached the arched portal, Brutus was standing guard as before. But this time he greeted her politely. "I've been expecting you," he said. "Can I go in?" "If you wait just a minute, I'll go get Justin." He went inside the arch and pressed a small button on the wall. Mrs. Frisbee had not noticed it before. "A doorbell," she said. "It rings a buzzer down below. If I push it 3 times, you're going to see some action." "Action?" "That's the alarm signal, and a dozen rats would come out this door ready to fight. All the rest, with the women and children, would be hurrying out the back door." "I didn't know there was a back door." "It comes out in the woods into blackberry bramble. It's just a longer tunnel than this one." When Justin appeared, they went down the same hallway as before, but this time, when they reached the chamber where the elevator and the stairway led down, Justin paused. "Nicodemus thought you might like to see our main hall. Just a quick look." "You said you asked about the plan." "I did," said Mrs. Frisbee, "but he didn't tell me about it. It's more than just a plan now, but we're used to calling it that. If you see the main hall, you'll get an idea of what's going down." So instead of going down as they had before, Justin led the way across the chamber where Mrs. Frisbee had noticed the tunnel continued. They walked along for what seemed like several minutes. "Somewhere right along here," Justin remarked, "you're entering the woods. You'll notice the tunnel runs a bit crooked. We had to bend it to go around the taproots, some as quick as fence posts." They went on until they came to a fork in the tunnel. "Right fork leads out to the blackberry bramble," said Justin. "The left fork leads to the main hall." They took the left fork. "Now brace yourself for a surprise." From ahead came noises, the sound of many rats talking, a sound of hurrying and thumping, and machinery running. They stepped into the room as full of activity as the factory. It was the biggest room Mrs. Frisbee had ever seen, half the size of her house, with a ceiling and a floor, hard gray rocks. It was brightly lit electric lights. Here, the large size lights strung unshaded, and beneath them were rats everywhere. Rats running electric motors that ran belts that ran circular saws, laths, drills, grindstones, and other tools that Mrs. Frisbee could not name. Rats hammering, rats welding, cutting, but most of all, rats hauling. There was a steady procession to and from the far end of the chamber, and each of these rats wore a harness to which was fastened a pair of large, sturdy sacks, one on each side, like a miniature pack horse. As the rats trooped in, their sacks were empty. They disappeared into a part of the room that was hidden by a high wall of wood, and when they came out, the sacks were full and heavy. As she watched a troop of 10, their sacks bulging, went back out into the tunnel. They greeted Justin and nodded to her, but they did not pause. She noticed that just inside the entrance, an electric fan whirred quietly, aiming inward, pulling fresh air into the room from somewhere out in the woods. Mrs. Frisbee stood beside Justin and gasped. She felt dizzy at the sight. The motion, the noise, the size of the room, which must have measured at least 20 feet long, most sides. "How could you ever dig out such a big room?" she asked. "We didn't," said Justin. "We found it. It's a natural cave. You can see that the ceiling and the floors are solid rock, and that's the reason, or the main one, we chose this spot to live. Others had lived here before us, probably for centuries before the farmhouse and the bears. And then wolves and foxes and groundhogs. We had quite a bit of cleaning to do, I can tell you that much. When we found it, there was a large hole only a few feet long, standing straight in, but it was so full of sticks and leaves you could hardly see it. We closed the entrance entirely and dug another one, longer and narrower, and then to our back door. Then we dug our living quarters under the rosebush and entrance you came in, but the cave is still our chief workshop. Let's go in." As they entered, some of the rats looked up. They waved and smiled, but all quickly turned back to the work that they were doing, and they are just in a hurry. "They're on a schedule," Justin explained, talking closely to Mrs. Frisbee's ear so she could hear above the noise. "So they cannot stop working." One group, especially busy, was gathered around an odd-shaped object of wood and metal about a foot long. It was curved and had a point at one end. It looked, Mrs. Frisbee thought, rather like the side of a small boat. Could the rats be making a boat? Then she saw that they were fastening a strong metal ring to the top of it. Justin led her to it. "That," he said, "is the most important invention, the key to the entire plan. We had a pilot model last made. We tried it out and it worked, so now we're going to make 3 more. What is it? It's a plow. Nicodemus designed it himself after reading every book he could find about farm tools. It's light and sharp, especially made to be pulled by rats. It takes 8 of us to pull it. More if the turf is tough, but with it, it can be turned over and in a day of hard work, a patch of earth about 10 to 15 feet wide. Why? What do you need it for? Come over here and I'll show you. He led the way to the back of the cave where the high wall stood. He opened a door and beckoned her through. She stood in a large wooden bin, staring at her feet, rising to a slope in the wall of the cave with a small mountain of grain. Oats, said Justin. He led her, opened another door to another mountain. Wheat, he said, and to other mountains. Barley, corn, soybeans. We've been building these stockpiles for a long time, he said, all from Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm. We now have a 2-year supplies for 180 rats, plus enough to plant for 2 years of crops, in case the first one fails. In there, he gestured toward the last bin in the row, we have boxes full of seeds. Seeds of tomatoes, beets, carrots, melons, and even more. All the time they stood there, the steady procession of rats continued. They entered the bins, they took off their harness sacks, filled the sacks with grain, put them on again, and left through the tunnel of the back door. They looked, Mrs. Frisbee thought, kind of like very large ants endlessly toiling on the ant hill. Justin must have got the same impression, for he said, "If the ants can do it," Nicodemus says, "and if bees can do it, us rats can do it too." Do what? Why, live without stealing, of course. That's the whole idea. That is the plan.